Hello YouTube and Facebook nations, Desktop Bible Guy here. Well, welcome to episode 5 of my Gospel of John series. Well, you recall from our last episode that we had reviewed the Jewish expectations regarding 3 eschatological figures, the Messiah, the prophet, and Elijah. And you'll recall me saying that John, when asked if he's going to fulfill the expectations for any of these figures, it says that he's not the Christ, nor the prophet, nor Elijah. Now the fact that John says that he's not Elijah is quite interesting, because it creates a potential for a possible scriptural problem. How can John say that he's not Elijah if Jesus in Matthew chapter 11 verses 13 and 14 seems to imply that he is Elijah? Matthew chapter 11, 13, and 14 says, "For the prophets and the law prophesied until John, and if you are willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come." Now, I think this apparent discrepancy can be easily reconciled if we simply recognize the fact that John is saying that he's not Elijah incarnate. You'll remember from the last episode that I said that it's quite possible that the Jews were expecting Elijah to literally come back to earth out of a cloud from heaven, because Elijah the prophet didn't die, but instead was taken up into heaven in a whirlwind in a pre-rapture type experience. And John is simply saying that if you're expecting me to come back out of heaven, I'm not going to do that. I'm not Elijah, I'm John. So John isn't lying, he's simply communicating who he understands himself to be. It's also quite possible that Jesus understood more about the true nature of John's ministry than even he himself did. John understands himself to be the forerunner of the Messiah, and therefore in our opening verse today, verse 23, he quotes Isaiah 40. John chapter 1 verse 23 says, I'm a voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, as Isaiah the prophet said. Now I'll go ahead and give you the full quotation from Isaiah 40 verses 3 through 5 in order to help you get the full context for it. So Isaiah 40 verses 3 through 5 says, "The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill brought low. The crooked places shall be made straight, and the rough places smooth. The glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken." So, John the Baptist, is seeing himself as one who is preparing the people for the coming of the Messiah and prepping their hearts for his coming. Okay, so moving on to chapter 1, verse 24. Chapter 1, verse 24 says, "Now they had been sent from the Pharisees." Now, I want to take just a minute and explain who the Pharisees are, because they will appear many times throughout the Gospels, and they serve as the primary antagonist to Jesus and his ministry. So I want to just give a quick explanation of who they are. Now, according to the Dictionary of Bible Themes, the Pharisees can be identified as a Jewish religious party whose members required a very strict adherence to the ritual law and the traditions of the elders. They're hostile to the teachings of Jesus Christ, whom they regarded as compromising their interpretation of the law as they saw it. Okay, so moving on to chapter 1, verse 25. And they asked him, and they said to him, "Why are you baptizing if you are not the Christ, nor Elijah, nor the prophet?" People normally baptized themselves. They weren't baptized by another. Additionally, within Judaism, baptism was reserved for proselytes or Gentile converts to Judaism. It was not seen as necessary for Jews to baptize themselves because they were already a part of the people of God and part of the covenant community. Now, within Jewish lands, there were quite a few people that identified as what we would call God-fearers. Now, God-fearers are people that are Gentiles but recognize Yahweh as the one true God, and therefore want to worship God properly and be as much a part of the covenant community as they can be. So they underwent circumcision, and they adopted the law of Moses and the dietary laws, and just did everything they could to follow the law of Moses. Baptism was seen as kind of a rite of initiation for this group of people. And like I said, since it had that kind of role as an initiation rite, natural-born Jews usually didn't undergo baptism because they were already Jews. So moving on to 126. John answered them, saying, "I baptize with water, but among you stands one whom you do not know." Now, John, because he sees his role as prepping the people's hearts for the coming of the Messiah, kind of views baptism in a very unique way. He says, "I baptize with water." Now, even though John is kind of viewing baptism in a unique way, it wouldn't be right to say that the Jews were not familiar with water being used as a symbol of spiritual renewal. As a matter of fact, this connection was very common. For example, in Ezekiel chapter 36 verse 25, it says, "Then I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you shall be clean, and I will cleanse you from your filthiness and from your idols." Additionally, Psalm chapter 51 verse 2 says, "Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin." And thirdly, Zechariah chapter 13 verse 1 says, "In that day a fountain will be opened for the house of David and for the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and from uncleanness." Okay, so now that the idea of spiritual renewal and water have been kind of clearly connected and clearly fleshed out, I want to move on to 127. 127 says, It is he who comes after me, the thongs of whose sandal I am not worthy to untie." It is clear from the text that John is announcing the coming of one whom the Jews do not yet know and who is higher than John. John is emphasizing his lowliness in comparison to the coming one by saying that he's not worthy to even take off Christ's sandals. In Jewish culture, it was clearly understood that the task of removing one's sandals was a task given to slaves and servants, because it was viewed as such an embarrassing thing that it wasn't proper for civilized people to do. And John is actually saying that I'm not even worthy to remove Christ's sandals. I'm not even worthy to be Christ's slave. It's important to understand that John didn't want to call attention to himself and the fact that he was anything special, but he wanted to draw people's attention to Jesus, and call people's attention to the fact that Jesus is the one that people should be following and giving their lives to, instead of himself. So he really just calls people's attention away from himself as something special. Okay, so we'll just wrap up quickly with 128 here before we call an end to the episode here today. 128 says, "These things took place in Bethany beyond the Jordan, where John was baptizing." Now, this is kind of very self-explanatory, actually. It's just saying that this verse kind of gives the setting for the scene that we've just been through. Now, it's a little bit strange to see the scene being laid out at the end of the discourse, but that is something that you actually see happen in John's Gospel quite often. We, as Americans, are used to kind of seeing the setting set out at the beginning of a block of text, but in the Bible, you see it kind of done sometimes at the end. So this is just a literary convention they had at the time. So, okay, so with that, I see that we've already gone beyond the 15-minute mark here. So I'll go ahead and end the episode here and just say thank you for watching today. I hope you can join me in the next episode. And until we meet next time, take care and God bless.